And so as we'll see as we go through this, what you're seeing here is the growth in debt has gone parabolic. It's compounding really rapidly. And this is why there's really this debt storm. It's not sustainable. This is just another little chart here. Bill in his intro talked about the debt ceiling. You can't possibly turn on television or listen to the radio or any kind of news media without understanding this debt ceiling. You can see that the U.S. debt back in the Carter days, Jimmy Carter, late 70s, was under $2 trillion. It was just a little over $1 trillion or so. That's now well over $16 trillion. This is just a massive increase in debt. Now, that's the US. If we look at this globally, because often I'll use individual countries, but what we find when we look at the US or Europe or Japan or Canada to a little bit lesser degree because of some fiscal responsibility, at least federally, that was pushed upon us really in the mid-1990s. But if you look at all of these various countries, it's a pretty similar picture, and it's just way too much debt. What this slide shows is the total global credit market. So it's the personal debt, the corporate debt, and the government debt. It's all the tradable debt out there in the world. In the last 10 years, what this chart is showing is that's gone from about 80 trillion to right currently, if we were to update this to current numbers, a little over $225 trillion around the world. So big increases, very, very rapid increases over the last 10 years. There's been quite the party going on, as you can see. And then this slide is the last one I'm going to give before I sort of shift our attention, really, what went wrong in the marketplace. I find this a very interesting slide also because if you look at the first rectangle there, that's the global population growth. So over the last 10 years, again from 2002 to 2011, the population has been growing at about 1.2% a year. The real GDP, or the growth in the economies, has been growing just sub 4%, 3.9. But the global credit markets, in other words, the debt out there, has been growing at over 10% per year, about 10.7. So you can see the debt's compounding just at a very rapid rate, much faster than economic growth. In other words, any kind of growth we're getting is totally related just to debt and more. But interesting, the last rectangle there, that large rectangle in red, is the expansion of the money supply. So this is looking at what they call the balance sheet of the central banks in the world. That's been growing at over 16% a year. So we've been funding this debt party, if you will, just with really a lot of new money and just printing a lot of money. We'll come back to that as an issue a little bit later in the presentation. So bottom line, debt, debt, and more debt. And this is really serious. This is not something that we should take lightly. So what went wrong? What went wrong? Well, from my perspective, again, having a business background, having studied in the business faculty for many years, if we look at the suggestions out there in the marketplace, and I'm sure you've seen the documentaries and you can listen to the television programs and so forth, this is some people say it's a political problem. Some people say, it's economic problem, and it's the big bad banks. Just blame the banks. Blame the financial service industry. Maybe it's an education problem. People don't know how to use a calculator, including our leaders and all the PhDs in finance and so forth. Maybe it's a regulatory problem. You just need more rules, more laws, and so forth. I suggest that those are effects from another cause. That the real cause of the problem is a massive worldview shift that we've seen throughout the Western world. And this shift is profound, and it's a faith-based shift. And that the regulatory problems, the political problems, the corruption, if you will, and some of the lending practices and banks and all of that are really effects of the underlying cause. And so that's why I want to today just spend a little bit of time and interact with the debt issue from that perspective. And so I think that's important. I start here with a quote from Dr. Francis Schaeffer, who was a very influential theologian and philosopher, passed away in the early 80s, but wrote extensively on social, economic, philosophical and theological issues. And he said the following, which if you could summarize is ideas have consequences, and bad ideas have bad consequences. And so what Schaeffer wrote, he says, there's a flow to history and culture. This flow is rooted and has its wellspring in the thoughts of people. People are unique in the inner life of the mind. What they are in their thought world determines how they act. This is true of their value systems, and it's true of their creativity. It's true of their corporate actions, such as political decisions, and it's also true of their personal lives. The results of their thought world flow through their fingers or from their tongues into the external world. This is true of Michelangelo's chisel, and it's also true of the dictator's sword. And so ideas have consequences. I would suggest, again, without spending too much time on this, because this is a very, very large area, that the biggest issue in terms of why we have all this debt, you've got to go back really to this secularization of the Western world, or the developed world as we now know it. We've had really a loss, if you will, or a gutting of the former Judeo-Christian foundation, which really has underpinned our economies and our way of life. You can call this postmodernism. If you spend much time in the university, you know that the universities are places where there's been the rejection of absolute truth, morality. There's been a loss of moral authority. You don't have to spend much time on the university campus to see that. And it's turned into a philosophy, if you will, of the baby boomers on, a philosophy of selfishness, of envy. We certainly see this in all of the tax debates that we have out there. It's really, I don't want to pay for it. I'll get my neighbor to pay for it. We'll use the tax system to expropriate someone else's property in order to cover the bills. And there really is no long-term discipline. There's no long-term vision in our developed world anymore. Throughout all of Europe and Japan and the United States, to a large degree here in Canada and so forth. This whole buy now, pay later mentality throughout the culture is encouraged not just by government policy, by our economic ideas, or I would say economic folly, and certainly by fiat currency. That is the power of government to issue currency at will with no collateral backing, which really was fully put in place, interestingly enough, in 1971, where a lot of the debt problems sort of started to arise in terms of the magnitude of the debt. Was also at the time where we took a lot of our developed countries, really virtually all of the developed countries, off of a gold standard, which kept governments at check to a certain extent, because you just couldn't issue money unless you had some gold backing. And so what went wrong? A massive worldview shift. Interesting, Christopher Dawson says that a secular society, a society that's not rooted in faith commitments and in truth, the belief in truth, a secular society that has no end beyond its own satisfaction is a monstrosity, a cancerous growth which will ultimately destroy itself. And I think that encapsulates our developed world, certainly the way we're running our economies. Other social factors, though, that show tremendous breakdown, which again correlate into our economy, because the way people act and behave ultimately will determine where the economy is going to go. And so I just list a few here that are indicators, again, over the last 40 years where these problems have just escalated in terms of issues. We see the issue of divorce, the undermining of heterosexual marriage. I'll come back to that issue in a moment. Pornography, abortions, suicide, falling educational standards, government dependency, massive social welfare systems that have been developed by the government, along with drug consumption, both legal and illegal. We're a prescription driven, if you will, population. Everybody's on a drug for something. And so you see this breakdown in so many different areas of our culture, not just in the economy, but my argument is to the extent you see them in your family structures and your other institutions in your society, you're definitely going to get it all impacted in your economics and your economy because of the economic decisions. And just one other slide I wanted to emphasize here to you. Having looked at this area and been in the study of economics for some time, I think it's important to emphasize that economics is a metaphysical science. In other words, a science above the physical, not a mathematical one. And the spiritual values of a society are much more important than the physical assets. And you see that in economies. Often economies that are not blessed with physical assets can be very strong and powerful if they've got good ideas and virtuous populations and an ethical base upon which they're operating. An economy is the sum ultimately of the spiritual and mental qualities of its people. And economic output is only as strong as the values of the society. And a society that has very, very low values will not produce much of value over time. And certainly a free market economy requires strong values, and a nation whose values are in decline will ultimately see a decline in the economy. And I think that really puts the finger on why all the debt, why living beyond our means, why we are an economy, we're a culture suffering from a values crisis and a truth crisis. Now, just to bring this home in, I think, a powerful way, I put up some images here, what went wrong. I've given you 4 images here, and I think these are images from my perspective that are preconditions, if you will, to wealth creation. If you don't value these 4, and I'm not saying these are the only 4, but these are 4 that I think are critical, then I cannot see over time you're going to have a strong, prosperous economy. And the one shot there, of course, children, babies. If you have no interest in the next generation, you have no interest in propagating the human race, and quite the contrary, you actually don't want children around, then how can you have a long-term, vibrant economy? How can you have an economy if you don't care about the next generation? And I would submit that a lot of the debt buildup that we're doing now is absolutely immoral theft from the next generation. And so we see this in our economy in spades, and I'll come back to that when we look at the demographics. When we think of intact families, the family unit has to be strong overall. The family unit is never perfect, but ultimately there has to be a strong emphasis on the heterosexual family as the building block, if you will, of society. There's never a time in history when you can attack that unit and survive in terms of your economy. And as I don't have to tell you, again, the attack upon the family unit. Care for the elderly, respect for life across the whole spectrum, looking after those who have put their time and effort into the economy and have been the ones that have gone before, and respecting them and using and taking advantage of their wisdom rather than deprecating them and making them inconvenient. And ultimately, as we see, tremendous problem with euthanasia in our own society and here in Canada. And then the last picture that is essential is ultimately you have to define your actions. You have to have a base of values, and that only can come through strong faith commitments. And ultimately, as a Christian, I'd argue those are going to come through strong Christian commitments. But you need faith, and ultimately all of our actions have to be defined within a moral framework, rights and wrongs. And if you gut faith institutions, then expect major trouble throughout your social institutions and also, of course, into your economy. And then this slide just talks a little bit about spiritual values. I ultimately believe it's spiritual values, it's ethical, it's moral values which drive the work ethic. And I've got a picture there of some gentlemen working very hard on some oil rigs. Innovation, creativity. What's going to drive that? Again, a passion that this is God's world and we can investigate it and we can understand it and there's uniformity in natural laws and it's worth investigating and making a difference. That comes from, again, a very strong framework of faith. Delayed gratification, saving. We don't have an economy where virtually no one saves anymore. But why do people save? Because ultimately they have a belief and they want to pass something on to the next generation. They're thinking longer term. And then the last image really brings to bear the picture of transformative capital projects. It's very hard to get any transformative capital projects done within the developed world anymore. You see some of them places like China and so on. But it's very hard because it requires massive future commitments. We'd rather build casinos. We'd rather turn our Ontario place into a casino rather than to build things that are going to be long-term, of course, in terms of productivity in our own province. So